Hello everyone, this is Micah History, and today we are going to be doing a very different video from usual, where instead of discussing a historical topic as in, whether we're talking about genealogy and ancestry of a family or of a particular individual, or we're covering a battle, or we're covering a war, or we're going over someone's biography or comparing historical figures and events. This is going to be my first ever video discussing something like this. Now, of course, you can tell what this is based on the title, because today we are going to be discussing what are the most popular topics in history. So, I have done some research and I believe that I have come to a conclusion. Now you might say, Micah, how could you have possibly determined what the most popular topics in history are, right? Because there's no objective way of measuring that, and that is correct. There's no way you can measure something like popularity because there's no metric. But I do think there are a lot of good proxies that can help us determine what are some of the most popular topics regarding history. So, first of all, let me explain what my methodology to find this out was first, and then we will get to the results. So, first of all, let's start by explaining a little bit about the data. So, the reason, first of all, that I even endeavored to do this was because basically I had a friend who was interested in me making a playlist for him of history videos that would be a good summary for him to get into world history. And of course, me being me, it ended up being a whole rabbit hole that lasted somewhere between 1 and 2 months. And I ended up not making one playlist, but I did make one playlist, but I divided into several playlists, and you'll understand why soon. So, how did I go about making this playlist for him for the most popular history topics that we can find? Well, of course, to start off, the data I'm using comes from YouTube. So, on my personal account, I am subscribed to around 360 YouTube channels, and that's a lot of channels. Some of you might think I don't keep up with them. I watch all the videos from all the different channels. Of course, a lot of them are not active. Now, of course, also as a history YouTuber, you aren't going to be very surprised to find out that the majority of these channels are history related. While I have not counted, I would guess somewhere around 275 to 300 of these channels discuss history. So already we're starting off with a pretty good database. But you could say, what if the channels you watch cover specific niche topics and that would skew your data? And of course that's true. There are definitely a lot of the channels that I watch that only cover certain regions, certain time periods, certain individuals, and I'm aware of that. But given the large and broad array of YouTubers that I watch, I do think that it is fairly accurate. And in particular, because there are a couple of channels which I call the general history channels, the one that just covers all the main historical topics, battles, events, people, all that. So some of these channels include Kings and Generals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Knowledgia or Knowledgia, however you pronounce that. Another one, History with Hilbert. There's definitely one big one I'm missing out. Armchair Historian is another one. And yeah, there are like one or two more of these. Epic History TV is another, although they don't make as many videos. But yeah, there are channels like this that just cover history from around the world. And I do think that they do a pretty good job. And so why do I share all this? Well, it is because these 275 to 300 channels are basically the channels that I chose as representative of the history community on YouTube as a whole. Of course, it can't be entirely representative, but also I am not able to find all history channels on YouTube, and so I believe that this is the best that I could do. In addition, one other thing that I want to say about this methodology is that I then went through each channel and found what I thought were some of the, I guess, most relevant historical topics. Because remember, the point of this whole project was to get videos that were good summaries of major world events. So of course I did not take every single video from every single one of these channels and put them all into a playlist. Instead, what I did is I took moments that I considered key events in world history and I put them all in a playlist. Now, of course, what that will do is that will, of course, skew things because, again, it is subjective. And again, right, the main topics, right, are going to be from the more well-known empires or historical figures or all that. So I'm aware that is the case. However, I will say that despite all that, I do think it is fairly representative because, again, these videos also tend to be the most popular ones, as in they're getting the most views, and therefore it is still pretty accurate in terms of measuring what are the most popular history topics. So that is basically the long, big context. So what I did is I made a playlist of 2,000 videos. So I think 2,000 videos is roughly representative of, you know, the most popular historical YouTube topics, although of course they translate very well into just what are the most popular topics in the history community in general. And so from this playlist, I divided it into several sub-playlists. Now, I'm not going to list all of them right now because it's way too long, but I will mention at the end of the video where you can find these playlists, so stay tuned till the end. And so now, with that being out of the way, I'm sure you're now all curious to figure out what were the most popular topics. Now, I put all of these playlists into a pie chart, but I realized that there were so many that I had to create categories of these playlists. So not every category I'm mentioning here is necessarily a playlist, but it is sort of a group of playlists that have similar things. And so with all of this context out of the way, let's get to the results, because I'm sure that is what you guys are all waiting for. So to start off, this is the first chart that we are looking at. So as you can see, there are a lot of colors, and so we will go through each one. So first of all, we found that 4.3% of the videos covered ancient history. Another 3.8% covered African history. 2.9% covered the Americas' history, although keep in mind the Americas is not including the United States, because the United States, for their part, they got 4.6%. Now, that again is not too surprising. Of course, ancient history is somewhat popular, but it's not like a huge thing. African history, same with the Americas, and so it doesn't surprise me that the United States gets a full 4.6%. Then 3.6% is for ancient Greece, which again is not that surprising. Now, definitely to nobody's shock, one of the largest slices in the pie belonged to Rome. So Roman history covered a full 7.3% of the content, and so I do think that, of course, demonstrates that people love the Roman Empire, and I'm sure all you guys think about the Roman Empire weekly and probably even daily. Then we got medieval European history, and you might be surprised to think it's 1.6% only, but keep in mind a lot of the medieval history overlaps with the history of individual countries, and that's why that percentage is so low. Then you get to Western European history, and by Western European history, what I mean by this category is Western European history after around the late 1400s. Until the present. So that is a 5.7%. Then we got Eastern European history, which again is the same time period, 4.3%. Then we get to some of the big European countries that I'm sure we're not surprised take up large chunks of the pie. So we get German history, which is 4.2%, British history, which is a massive 7.1%, French history, 3.9%. Russian history is the same, 3.9%. Nordic history, 2.5%. And as you can imagine, a large part of that is Vikings, of course, but then there is also other stuff, especially Swedish Empire and all that. Then you get East Asian history, which is 3.2%, but that excludes Chinese history, which makes up a full 4%. And then you get South Asian history, which I was surprised to see was only 2.6%, so I guess not a very popular thing. And then the largest category actually was Islamic history with an 8.1%. However, of course, don't let these numbers mislead you, right? You could conclude from this that, oh, Islamic history must be the most popular topic on YouTube. But again, I am combining all of the histories of all of the different Islamic countries. Whereas, for example, in Western Europe alone, we had a separate category for France, for Britain, for Germany, and then I guess Rome, if you want to consider that a Western European. And so this basically covers the majority, over 3/4 of the content is about histories of different countries. And of course, this includes individuals who are pivotal. But then the rest, comes to no shock, is about wars. So wars that are not World War I, World War II, and the Cold War made up 4.1%. Of course, World War I was a very popular topic, 3.3%. World War II, unsurprisingly, 7.2%. Cold War, 3.1%. And then other topics in general, 3.3%. And so what we get from this, right, is that the countries with the most popular history are the Americans, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the Germans, the British, the French, the Russians, and the Chinese. And again, this isn't really that surprising. These are topics that we often see coming up in the history community. But what if we want to look at a different chart? What if we want a more broad view? Well, that brings us to our second chart. So in our second chart, what we see here is a simpler version of this. So we see that ancient history, again, 4.3%, African history, 3.5%, so fairly similar. Now, then we get Latin American history, which is about 1.3%. Now, what's interesting at this point, though, is that Anglophone history, so combining, of course, all the Anglophone countries, which is basically the United Kingdom, the United States, that combined is 12.4%. So we see that Anglophone history is a very large and popular category in the history community. Now, of course, Anglophone history is just barely surpassing Greco-Roman history with almost 11%, 10.9%. And again, Greeks and Romans are always very popular things to cover. And again, we get the medieval European with 1.6%. Then we got Romance history. And Romance history is basically French, German, or what am I saying? French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, right? So that's the Romance history. You might say Romanian, but Romanian would fall under Eastern European, which again is mainly Russian with a lot of other countries. And that's 8.2%. And then with the same percentage, we get Germanic history, which again is the history of the Germanic peoples minus the Anglophones. Then we get to East Asian history, which is 7.2%, South and Southeast Asian 3.8%, and then Islamic history, which is 8.1%. Then I made another category for wars, excluding the World Wars and the Cold War, which again was 4.1%. Then the World Wars, 10.5%, Cold War, 3.1%, and other categories were 3.3%. And so now with less categories, let's analyze this chart a little bit more. Well, the results of this show that Anglophone history is the most popular topic in the history community. However, this is where we have to, again, mention how this cannot be completely representative. Right, this is going to be the most popular topic within Anglophone spaces, right? Now, of course, I'm sure that even in other countries, Anglophone history is still fairly popular and well known because, again, they've had so much influence on society. But given that I'm making this video in English, you understand English, and probably you're watching English YouTube and watching English history YouTubers, it makes sense that Anglophone history, probably there's some bias to that. But then you get to Greco-Roman history, and there's less bias, but again, most people, especially in this space, and the people I'm watching are probably white, of European origin, Western civilization. So again, makes sense why Greco-Roman history plays such a prominent role. But then again, Greco-Roman history is so fascinating that it would make up a large chunk nevertheless. But we see that apart from Anglophone history, Greco-Roman history is the second most popular topic to cover on YouTube in the history space. Then after that, you get to the World Wars. And of course, World Wars doesn't really take a genius to explain why those are popular. They are recent, they covered the entire world, and again, they are wars, and wars always do well because we all know that the average history, channel has about 97% male fan base. So that is no surprise. But then I was slightly shocked to see how well Islamic history did, although then again, Eastern European, Romance, and Germanic history were all close, but they're all kind of neck and neck, which shows that the three other major regions of Europe all played a significant role in history, and it reflects in terms of what are the most popular things to cover. So, Romance history, 8.4, Eastern European and Germanic, 8.2. Right? So again, this isn't surprising. Covering especially Western European history is always a go-to move if you are trying to get popular. But then again, I was sort of surprised and pleasantly surprised by how much Islamic history was covered. Then of course, East Asian history is also a fairly popular topic to cover. We got 7.2%. One thing though that was very surprising and disappointing was how little coverage we have of South and Southeast Asian history. I mean, altogether, both these regions make up less than 4% of the videos that were used in my database. And I was sort of surprised by how high African history was, because it was 3.5%, which is basically almost the same amount. And then Latin American, again, always they get the short end of the stick, only 1.3%. So pretty sad. Now, of course, you'll notice that places like Oceania pretty much get nothing. But again, Oceania kind of just always the forgotten part of the world. And it makes sense, very irrelevant historically, and has a tiny population and is barely visible on the map. So, yeah, that pretty much is a good summary of what are the most popular, categories in the history YouTube space. But now I want to go into specific countries' history because I think this is quite interesting. So we're going to move on to this third chart. And in this third chart, we can see which countries are the most popular to cover. So, unsurprisingly, although actually somewhat surprisingly, number one is England. Now again, given the fact that we are English-speaking countries and English dominates the internet and the world in general, but that said, I was expecting Roman history to be higher than English, but nevertheless, I was wrong. So English history is actually the most popular, and again, out of this percentage, we're only considering countries, so like not world wars or anything. But English history is the most popular history to cover, and that is a full 12% of the content I found on YouTube was covering English history. Then, of course, to no one's surprise, Roman history was next with a full 10.9%, so almost 11%. But that said, the next was American history at 8%, and so we can really see that, English and American history is very popular. And I think part of the reason English history is popular is because American history is popular. A lot of Americans watching. And because American history doesn't go back that far, a lot of it is, ends up being transferred to English history. So basically, English, Roman, and American are the top three countries' histories to cover. Then, after that, the next most popular topic is Chinese history, 7%. And again, that makes sense. China has such a long and fascinating history. It's not really a big surprise that China ends up being the seventh or the fourth most popular country to be covered historically. After China, you get France, 6.8%, which again isn't too surprising. France has a very long and rich history. Then Soviet history, and for a country that didn't last that long, it's quite a lot. 5.4% of the content covered Soviet history. And then we get into smaller groups. So what sort of surprised me, the Ottoman history actually was the next largest category, with Ottoman history covering 4.6%. After the Ottomans, then you get the Germans. German history covered 3.9%. But again, Prussian history covered 3.2%. So that's why if you combine them, it gets higher. But, I was doing each individual country. Keep in mind, though, you could say, well, why don't you do the same for England, UK, whatever? I would say the difference is that at least England always covered most of modern-day Britain, whereas Prussia did not for a long time cover most of Germany. So that's why I made that distinction there. But yes, pretty much Prussian history, 3.2%, German history, 3.9%. Afterwards, you get to Russian history. And again, of course, this is excluding the Soviet Union, and so that is 2.8% was Russian history. Then you get Spanish history, 2.4%. And then you get smaller percentages, but not that by that much, which is Italian history, 2.3%, but then, of course, that's not considering the Romans. Mongol history is actually 2.6%. Japanese history is 2.3%. And then after that, you get other groups that are not as popular. So these are all within the 1% range. You got Eastern Roman history, that's actually 2%. So Eastern Roman history, 2%. Egyptian history, 1.8%. Athenian history, 0.7%. You have Swedish history, 0.9%. Korean history, 1.5%. And Abbasid history, 1.1%. So again, a lot of this is not too surprising, but some of it actually was surprising. But yeah, we can see that the most popular countries, right? England, Rome, USA, France, and China. Now, when it came to wars, I also made another chart for that because I thought it was quite fascinating. So what are the most popular wars to cover in the history space? Now, to no one's surprise, World War II was by far the largest, with a full 30% of the content I found covering World War II. Then just under half of that covers World War I at 14%. But okay, after World War II and World War I, what are the most popular wars? Now, of course, keep in mind these are not all necessarily individual wars. These can be several wars that are related. But I actually found that the fall of the Anglo-Saxons was the next most popular topic. The amount of videos on 1066 was pretty surprising to me, but at the same time, it's a pivotal moment in history, so it kind of makes sense. So that was a 4.7% with fall of the Anglo-Saxons, which, by the way, really just is 1066. Afterwards, you got the 100 Years' War at 4.4%. So again, both of these from English history. Then the next largest one was again from an Anglophone perspective, and this was the American Revolutionary War with 3.7% covering that conflict. Afterwards, you had the Russian Revolution and the Greco-Persian Wars, with both of these standing at 3.5%. The Indochina Wars, so basically first Indochina War and then the Vietnam War combined, 3.5%. And then after that, you get wars that are in the 2%. So you get the Punic Wars, you get the fall of the Roman Empire, you get the French Revolution, you get the Opium Wars, the Taiping and Boxer Rebellions, the American Civil War, the Chinese Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and then under that you get the Cuban Revolution, 1.9%. But yeah, it is pretty interesting though to see what are the most popular wars to cover. And we have one final chart here. And you'll notice there are a lot less categories, and these are the most popular historical figures to cover. So, to no one's real shock, there are only 3 dominant figures here: Napoleon, Alexander, and Julius Caesar. Now, Napoleon comes at number 1, and given his incredible accomplishments, it is unsurprising that Napoleon came first. Now, I was sort of surprised to see Julius Caesar above Alexander the Great. And maybe, I don't know. I always feel like Alexander is greater than Julius, but maybe that's a controversial thing. But I think it's just because Alexander just, never lost, conquered so much. But Julius Caesar did a lot and probably was more impactful in terms of administration and legacy and all that. So, but yeah, Napoleon, 26.5%. Julius Caesar, 23.5%. Alexander the Great, 19.6%. Keep in mind, right, I didn't cover every historical figure, only the ones who had enough people covering them to get their own playlist. Then after that, the most popular was Henry VII, which is interesting, but I think that's mostly biased because History with Hilbert made a lot of videos on him. Then you got Augustus, makes sense, first Roman emperor, Alfred the Great, and Vlad the Impaler. So again, this is the chart to, take with the biggest grain of salt because, of course, it's a very small sample size. But nevertheless, though, I think it does show, right, who the trinity of historical figures are, right? And again, no surprise, these are all great conquerors, but also great leaders and administrators. So Napoleon, Alexander, and Julius Caesar. So to recap everything that I've just said, what are the most popular topics to cover in history? Well, to start off, the most popular topic is Anglophone history, and to be more specific, British history. And if you want to be more specific than that, English history, although it's like very overlapping. After that, it is Greco-Roman history. And of course, most of that is Roman history. Then, after this, you get World War II, which is the most popular war, of course, to cover. After this, you also, if you want to get a little more specific, you get American history, you get German history, and you get Chinese history. I believe those are the most common ones here, yeah. So American, German, and Chinese are after British and Roman, the most popular countries to cover. But if you want to take broader categories, Islamic history, Romance history, Eastern European history, and Eastern European history are all also very good topics to cover. And stuff like World War I is also not a bad thing to cover either. So, if you are an aspiring history YouTuber and you are trying to think of how do I crack the algorithm, how do I become a super successful YouTuber, well, basically here is my recommendation. Make videos on Roman history, make videos on British history, make videos on American history, make videos on Napoleon, on Alexander, and on Julius. And so if you get the three great men and the three great empires, and then for wars, World War I, World War II, and the Cold War, the three great wars, well then you are set. Now, if only I followed my own advice, maybe I would get more subscribers, and also maybe I'd finally get someone commenting in the comment section.